One of the strongest human beings who ever lived may have survived because other people fed him. Read that sentence again, slowly, and let it sit for a moment before we go any further, because that single line should stop us before this story even begins. It should make us pause the moment, put down whatever else we were about to do, and lean toward the fire. It does not fit the image most viewers carry when they hear the word Neanderthal. The image is familiar, worn smooth by 100 years of magazine drawings, museum reconstructions, and cheap film monsters. A heavy brow ridge, a massive chest, shoulders like stone, arms built like iron bars, a frozen plain where only muscle mattered and only the largest lived. A creature of force, not of feeling, a winner in a world ruled by ice, or a loser dragged down by his own weight, a silhouette in a snowstorm, a grunt in the dark, a dead end on the family tree of humanity. And if that image were the whole picture, the story would be simple and short and easy to forget. The strongest humans who ever walked the earth should have outlasted everyone. In a frozen continent, strength should have been enough. Cold should have been an enemy they defeated, generation after generation, without help from tenderness or memory, or the quiet, unspoken work of other hands. Their story should have ended with victory, or at worst with a slow retreat under overwhelming force. Instead, it ends in something far stranger. Their story ends without a battlefield, without a written surrender, without a monument. And, as we will see, in a certain deep sense, it does not end at all, because deep inside Shanidar Cave, in the folded limestone ridges of the Zagros Mountains of what is now northern Iraq, the bones of one Neanderthal man have been whispering a very different story for more than 60 years. His skeleton is known simply as Shanidar I. When archaeologists first lifted his remains out of the sediment, they saw something the old caricature could not explain. He had lived with severe injuries. One arm had been badly damaged, possibly to the point of being nearly useless. His skull carried signs of hard trauma above the eye. His limbs recorded major problems with movement, arthritis eating into old joints, and possibly a foot that never worked well again after some ancient accident. Some interpretations even suggest he may have had reduced vision or hearing on one side of his face. Yet he did not die at once. He did not fall where he was hurt. He lived on, likely for years, in a world without hospitals, medicine cabinets, farms, stored grain, ambulances, painkillers, or paid caretakers. In a world where every single meal had to be won from a cold and dangerous landscape by living hands, that survival is not a small detail. That survival is a signal. It suggests patience. It suggests memory. It suggests cooperation. It suggests that when he could not hunt, someone else hunted for him. When he could not walk far, the group moved slowly with him or brought food back. When he could not chew certain things, softer parts of the meal were left for him near the fire. It suggests, at its quietest and most powerful level, care. And the moment we accept that, the whole story cracks open. Because it means that inside the body of one of the strongest humans who ever lived, there was also one of the oldest recorded traces of human tenderness we have ever found. That is where this documentary truly begins. Not with a roar in the darkness, not with a mammoth charging through swirling snow, not with the tired fantasy of a savage superhuman ruling the Ice Age by pure violence. It begins with a broken body that should not have lasted, and did. Because if we want to understand why the Neanderthals survived for hundreds of thousands of years, and why they finally disappeared, we have to abandon the simplest version of the story. Their strength was real. Their toughness was real. Their bodies were extraordinary in ways that would embarrass most modern athletes. But their history was never a tale of muscle alone conquering nature. It was a longer, harder, stranger tale, shaped by cold, shaped by scarcity, shaped by injury and infection, shaped by cooperation, shaped by culture, shaped by slow climate whiplash, shaped by hunger and repeated crisis, and in the end, shaped by an encounter with another kind of human that changed the story forever. For an immense stretch of time, Neanderthals occupied a vast world reaching across Europe and into Western Asia, from the cold Atlantic edges of what is now Spain and Portugal, through the plains and river valleys of Central Europe, along the coasts of the Mediterranean, across the mountains of the Levant, and deep into the interior of what is now Russia, Siberia, and Central Asia. They did not live in one climate or one landscape. Their world was not a single frozen postcard. They moved through many worlds across hundreds of thousands of years. Open steppe, broken woodland, river valleys, rocky uplands, coastal plains, wind-hollowed caves, and quiet rock shelters. Their lands warmed, and then cooled, and then warmed again. In these back-and-forth pressures, their bodies became compact, powerful, and well-suited to holding on to heat. Their rib cages grew broad. Their limbs stayed shorter than those of many later Homo sapiens populations. Their bones recorded a life of heavy physical strain. They were built, over unimaginable time, to work and endure in harsh settings. And for decades that image invited a kind of prehistoric myth. Bigger body, bigger strength, simpler answer, simpler mind. If they were so powerful, they must have been simple. If they were so simple, they must have been doomed. The insult was buried inside the admiration. The very word Neanderthal became, in ordinary English, a way of calling someone stupid, or brutal, or hopelessly out of date. That word did a great deal of damage to our understanding of them, and it took generations of scientists to begin undoing it, because the evidence, when read honestly, kept refusing that easy story. It refused it in the caves, it refused it in the tools, it refused it in the bones. It refused it most of all in the moments when Neanderthals did something no simple brute could ever have done. Neanderthals were not just strong. They were organized enough to survive repeated climatic swings that would have shattered a less flexible people, skilled enough to shape stone with planning rather than luck, working through a series of preparatory strikes to release a flake whose shape had already existed in the toolmaker's mind, capable enough to half tools with adhesive made from birch bark that had to be heated in carefully controlled conditions, wise enough to keep fire alive across seasons, efficient enough to process carcasses down to the marrow inside the bone, careful enough to work hides into usable material night after night by firelight, brave enough or hungry enough to move across dangerous landscapes in pursuit of some of the largest and most dangerous animals the age had ever produced. Some of their skeletons record group care that lasted for years across serious disability. Some of their sites show remarkable, hard-won familiarity with local prey and terrain. Finds from places like Krapina, Bruniquel, Shanidar, Kebara, La Ferracie, La Chapelle aux Saints, Vindija, Chagirskaya, and dozens more raise harder questions about cognition, communication, memory, meaning, and even something we can only cautiously call symbolic thought. Their story is not the story of a failed almost human. It is the story of a successful human lineage that endured for hundreds of millennia and then, under pressures that on paper seem smaller than the ice they had already survived, came apart. That is the contradiction at the heart of Neanderthal history, and it is the reason their story still haunts us. They survived cold that would kill most modern people within a matter of hours if stripped of clothing and shelter. They hunted dangerous animals at close range, often within reach of horns, tusks, and hooves. Their bodies could absorb punishment that sounds almost impossible when read from a modern medical chart. They spread across difficult environments and stayed there for an immense span of time. And yet, around 40,000 years ago, they vanished as a distinct human form. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic last stand on a windy cliff above a frozen sea, not necessarily in one final war between species. They faded region by region, valley by valley, generation by generation, while another kind of human, our own, expanded across the same broad world. So what exactly failed? Was it climate? That answer seems too simple, because Neanderthals had already endured terrible cold many times before. Was it violence from Homo sapiens? That answer is dramatic, but the evidence does not clearly support a continent-wide extermination event. Was it inferior intelligence? That older claim has weakened again and again under the growing weight of archaeological findings. Was it a small population size, broken social links, changing prey, punishing energy demands, a risky hunting system, more isolated groups, weaker long-distance exchange, a bad run of overlapping pressures that finally became impossible to absorb? Was it perhaps all of these things at once, arriving in a season when the door of history briefly narrowed and only one human form slipped through? And what does the phrase "the strongest humans" really mean? If strength means raw physical force, Neanderthals belong near the top of the human story. Their anatomy leaves little room for doubt. They were enormously powerful. If strength means surviving as a lineage through repeated glacial and interglacial changes, they were strong in a deeper sense still. If strength means carrying children through cold seasons, moving food, preserving fire, teaching tool skill, remembering roots, caring for injured adults, and keeping a small band alive through one more winter, then the word grows larger than muscle. It becomes social strength, technical strength, metabolic strength, emotional strength, the kind of strength that leaves almost no monuments except bones, stone, ash, cut marks on eagle talons, and traces of ancient DNA still moving inside living people right now. And perhaps that is why Neanderthals still trouble us. They do not fit neatly into the old story of progress. They were not apes on the edge of becoming human. They were human in a different way, close enough to us that people alive today, outside sub-Saharan Africa, still carry a small percentage of Neanderthal ancestry inside their own cells, in every organ, in every heartbeat. Different enough that if one stepped into their winter camps, their faces, gestures, tools and quiet rhythms might feel strangely foreign. Strong enough to master cold landscapes for an astonishing length of time. Vulnerable enough that when the balance finally shifted, they could not hold their ground forever. This documentary follows that balance from beginning to end. We will begin with the body itself. What Neanderthal strength really was. What cold did to shape it. Why even the most powerful body carries a hidden bill. Then we will move into the hard economy of Ice Age survival, into calories, into fat, into risky hunts, into tool systems, hides, fire, and the brutal logic of winter. From there, the story grows more human and more complicated. Care for the injured, the slow transfer of skill across generations, the question of speech, the traces of decoration, deep cave construction, and the deliberate treatment of the dead. Each piece matters, because every one of them pushes back against the lazy image of Neanderthals as slow, simple brutes. But all of that only sets up the final mystery, because once we see them clearly, once we understand just how capable they really were, their disappearance becomes harder, not easier, to explain. The old insult vanishes. The real question arrives. How does a people so well fitted to survival lose their place in the world? What happens when a body evolved for endurance meets an age of rapid instability? What happens when highly local knowledge suddenly has to compete with a larger social web reaching across whole continents? What happens when a lineage adapted to one style of life faces overlapping pressures in climate, demography, competition, and time? And one more question remains, waiting at the end of every chapter. If the Neanderthals vanished, why are they still here? Not as a separate people walking the earth. That chapter closed. But in our genomes, in the immune signals we carry, in some traits inherited from a lost lineage, in a slowly changing understanding of what a human can be, they remain. Their disappearance was not a clean erasure. It was a transformation of the human story itself. Before us stood another humankind, powerful, skilled, vulnerable, intimate, mortal. And to understand why they vanished, we must first understand why they lasted so long. To understand why they lasted so long, we must first understand what it meant to have a body like theirs in a world like theirs. And to understand that, we have to leave the museum, walk out of the cave mouth, and step into the wind. Because in the Ice Age, the wind was always waiting. Chapter 1. Bodies built by long winters. To call the Neanderthals the strongest humans who ever lived is not empty drama. It rests on anatomy. It rests on skeletons pulled out of cave floors, river deposits, and rock shelter sediments across an enormous region. It rests on measurements taken again and again, in different laboratories, on different continents, by researchers who often disagreed about interpretation, but rarely disagreed about the basic shape of the evidence. When paleoanthropologists reconstruct Neanderthal bodies from remains found across Europe and Western Asia, one pattern repeats across the entire population, across immense time, across landscapes that could not be more different from one another. It is the pattern of a body built for endurance in a world that never really gave in. These were not tall, lightly built people. They were, on average, shorter than many later human populations, standing somewhere around 160 to 170 centimeters as adults, but far heavier through the trunk, shoulder, hip, and limb bones. Their skeletons were robust in the plain sense of the word. Thick shafts, strong joint surfaces, broad chests, deep pelvises, powerful muscle attachments carved into the bone by decades of hard use. The whole body plan suggests a human form that regularly produced force, carried weight, and lived under intense mechanical stress from childhood onward. If you compared one of their thigh bones to an average modern equivalent, the Neanderthal bone would often be noticeably thicker walled, its ridges of muscle attachment more pronounced, its whole structure denser and more insistent. Yet the meaning of that strength is easy to distort, and the distortion has followed Neanderthals for more than a century. It is tempting to imagine them as oversized fighters, as if the entire purpose of their evolution was combat, as if their bodies were built for a war that never ended. But bones do not point us first toward battle. They point us toward climate, movement, labor, and energy. Their power was one part of a much larger survival package, shaped over an unimaginable span of time by repeated life in colder environments than the ones in which our own species first evolved. Their story is not the story of gym-made muscle or of angry giants. It is the story of bodies selected across thousands of generations by cold air, hard ground, dangerous prey, exhausting travel, and the endless daily work of staying alive under conditions that would defeat most modern people within a week. Their faces were distinctive. Their mid-faces projected forward more than ours do. Their brow ridges were strong and continuous. Their skulls were long and low, compared with the more rounded brain case of recent humans. Their cheekbones swept back rather than jutted forward. Their noses were large, For many decades, this last feature became a favorite point in popular writing. The idea was simple and attractive. A large Neanderthal nose must have been a perfect cold weather machine, warming and moistening frigid air before it reached the lungs. There is some logic there. Larger nasal passages may indeed have helped process cold and dry air. But more recent work has made scholars far more careful. Not every striking feature should be turned into a neat engineering solution. Some aspects of Neanderthal facial form may reflect a blend of ancestry, growth patterns, biomechanical demands from chewing, breathing needs, and other pressures rather than one single cold adaptation story. The responsible answer is stronger than the myth, and also more modest. Their faces were part of a broader body pattern, associated with life in cold and energetically demanding settings, but no single feature should be lifted out of context and treated as proof of magical adaptation. The broader pattern, however, remains clear and consistent. Neanderthal bodies were compact. In cold conditions, compactness matters. A shorter, stockier body tends to lose heat more slowly than a taller, more slender one, because the relationship between surface area and body mass is not equal. Biologists sometimes describe this using principles known as Bergmann's rule and Allen's rule. In simple language, animals living in colder places often do better with larger, rounder bodies and relatively shorter limbs, because such bodies conserve heat more efficiently. Neanderthals fit that pattern more closely than early Homo sapiens, whose ancestors evolved in warmer African climates. Their forearms and lower legs were comparatively shorter. Their trunks were deep. Their whole build suggests a human population repeatedly shaped by the need to keep heat inside. If you imagine a tall, thin bottle of hot water and a short, round bottle of hot water set side by side on a freezing morning, the round one holds warmth longer. The Neanderthal body, in its rough proportions, was the round bottle. That compact power came with great cost. A large, heavily muscled body burns energy simply to exist. So does thermoregulation in cold environments. So does carrying equipment, climbing broken ground, butchering carcasses, processing hides, hauling firewood, and nursing children through winter. Strength is expensive. Every advantage written into the body has to be paid for, again and again, in food. That means Neanderthal anatomy cannot be understood apart from the landscape that fed it, and it cannot be admired without also acknowledging the daily debt it imposed. Consider the chest. Neanderthals had broad rib cages, and reconstructions suggest a thorax shaped for high respiratory demand. Whether every old popular claim about their lungs should be accepted is another matter, but the general picture is still compelling. This was a body likely adapted to high energy turnover. It needed calories, and not a small trickle of them. Estimates vary depending on method, sex, body size, climate, and activity level, and researchers still debate the exact numbers. Some studies suggest that adult Neanderthal males could require anywhere from around 4,000 to more than 5,000 kilocalories a day under normal conditions, with peaks reaching much higher during hard winter labor. Others give more conservative numbers, but the broad conclusion is consistent across many discussions of Neanderthal energetics. Their daily energy requirements were high. A male Neanderthal moving through cold terrain and engaged in active hunting could need striking amounts of food, and demand almost certainly rose during winter, illness, or hard travel. Even when scholars disagree about the fine numbers, they do not disagree that this was an expensive body to maintain. And that changes the title question at once. The strongest humans who ever lived were also among the humans most trapped by energy demand. A modern person can admire a strong body without ever asking who feeds it. In the Pleistocene, that question came first, every single day, from the first breath at dawn to the last thought before sleep. Every thick bone and every powerful limb meant that the band had to win enough calories from a dangerous world. When a herd moved away, when weather changed, when an injury slowed a hunter, when a cold season stretched longer than expected, the very body that gave Neanderthals an advantage could become a burden. A larger engine needs more fuel. When the fuel supply falters, the larger engine suffers first. There is a kind of quiet tragedy hidden inside that arithmetic, a knife edge that ran through every day of Neanderthal life. Their strength also tells us something about the kinds of work they regularly performed. The wear patterns and old injuries recorded on many Neanderthal remains are not random. Some researchers have compared these injury patterns to those seen in people exposed to repeated close-range danger, though older comparisons, especially the famous rodeo rider analogy, should now be used carefully. What remains persuasive is the wider point. Neanderthals lived close to risk. Their hunting methods likely brought them within touching distance of very large prey. Their environments were physically demanding, both above and below the visible landscape. Their joints and bones often speak of lives in which force was used directly, at short range, and repeatedly. You can almost see it in the shoulders of certain remains. Muscle marks etched into bone from years of thrusting, scraping, hauling, and holding. This matters because the popular image of Neanderthals often splits into two false extremes. In one version, they are dull brutes whose strength substitutes for skill, muscle standing in for mind. In the other version, modern audiences, eager to correct the old insult, swing too far and describe them as simply us in slightly heavier bodies, indistinguishable in every meaningful way. The evidence suggests something more interesting and, in the end, more human. They were neither caricature nor mirror. They were a related human form with a distinctive anatomical package, one that offered real advantages in certain environments and imposed serious limits in others. Not lesser, not identical, but different, and shaped by pressures we can barely imagine from our warm and well-fed rooms. Their brains fit this same complex pattern. On average, Neanderthal cranial capacity could match or even exceed the average, often cited for recent humans, with figures commonly falling somewhere between around 1,400 and 1,600 cubic centimeters. But brain volume is not a trophy on a shelf. Larger does not mean smarter in some tidy ranking. Part of that volume relates to body size, part to sensory or motor demands. Their visual systems may have faced different pressures. Their bodies required constant control across rough terrain. Their environments required deep and durable spatial knowledge, held over years and shared across a band. The honest conclusion is not that Neanderthals had better brains than us in the modern sense. It is that they had large brains, wired for complex life, capable of technical behavior, hunting coordination, social care, teaching, long-term ecological knowledge, and, as we will see later, quite possibly forms of symbolic thought. The older assumption that they were mentally crude has become increasingly hard to defend from evidence. Now place such a body in its actual world. Much of the public still imagines the Ice Age as a continent buried continuously under deep snow and walls of ice. In reality, Neanderthal habitats varied greatly across time and region. Huge ice sheets did exist farther north, but many Neanderthals lived in cold, open environments often described as steppe or steppe tundra, mixed in some periods with woodlands or patchier habitats depending on climate fluctuations. These were not gentle lands. They were windy, seasonal, unpredictable. Fuel could be limited. Prey moved. Plant resources varied wildly by month and by mile. Cold seeped into every weakness of shelter, clothing, and body. Even in warmer intervals, life was not soft. Forests brought their own risks. Rivers flooded. Diseases travelled with humidity. In such places, being compact mattered. Having thick insulation in the form of body mass mattered. Efficient heat conservation mattered. But those were only first defenses. A body can help you lose heat more slowly. It cannot feed itself. It cannot sew a hide together at night by firelight. It cannot keep a hearth burning while a storm shakes the entrance of a rock shelter. It cannot explain to a child where reindeer will cross next season. So even at the most physical level, Neanderthal strength points beyond anatomy toward culture and social life. Their childhoods must have been hard schools. A Neanderthal body was not born at full power. It had to grow into it, and growing meant years of dependency, watching, imitating, failing, learning, and repeated exposure to danger. Studies of dental growth in Neanderthal children suggest that they may have matured slightly faster in some respects than modern children, but they still needed a long period of learning before they could feed themselves fully. Children had to survive long enough to become the robust adults whose bones we now admire in museum cases. That required adults who could gather, process, protect, teach, and remember. A single strong hunter does not create a lineage lasting hundreds of thousands of years. A functioning group does, over and over, generation after generation. The same body that seems so impressive in a museum case would also have been vulnerable in ordinary ways. Frost does not care about pride. A twisted ankle on icy ground can threaten the entire band if mobility is central to finding food. A broken tool can mean lost calories. A failed hunt can leave children hungry. A severe tooth infection, unnoticed for weeks, can become life-threatening. A compact body may keep heat better, but if it is injured, it becomes harder for others to feed. The strength of Neanderthals, therefore, cannot be measured only by the force of their muscles. It has to be measured by the stability of the whole system around them, the network of hands and voices and memories that kept them alive across the long cold. Even the famous heaviness of their skeletons should be read in that broader way. Thick bone can reflect repeated loading across a lifetime. It suggests bodies that worked brutally hard, often from a young age. There is admiration in that, but there is also a warning. These were costly lives. The evidence does not support any fantasy of carefree cave giants strolling through a land of easy prey. To carry such bodies through glacial cycles required relentless effort. The cold shaped them, yes, but it also made every success temporary and every weakness dangerous. One more point matters before we go deeper into the daily work of survival. Neanderthals were not identical across all times and all places. They lived for a very long span across a broad range. Early forms and later populations, Western groups and Eastern groups, all existed within changing climates and local ecologies. So whenever we speak of the Neanderthal body, we are speaking about a general pattern, not a frozen stereotype. Some individuals were larger, some smaller. Some environments harsher, some milder. Some populations may have experienced different degrees of isolation or contact with their neighbors. Responsible history leaves room for variation, and that variation itself will become important later, when we ask why they finally faded. Still, the overall image remains powerful. If one met a healthy adult Neanderthal male at close range, especially in a hunting context, the physical impression would be formidable. Even healthy adult females, though smaller on average, would probably have appeared strongly built by modern expectations. These were people whose bodies had been honed by difficult conditions across immense time. They were not weak, not fragile, and not accidental. They were one successful human answer to Pleistocene Eurasia. But answers can become traps. A lineage built for one kind of ecological challenge may struggle when the challenge changes too quickly or in too many directions at once. Strength evolved under one system does not automatically transfer to every new one. The body that conserves heat beautifully may still depend on prey distributions that no longer hold. The chest that powers a hard life may still demand calories that a weakening social network cannot supply. The short limb that helps in cold may mean less than broader alliances when environments fragment into pockets separated by uncertain distance. That is why the body, however dramatic, is only the first chapter. Neanderthals were strong because the Ice Age made strength necessary. But necessity is not victory. To understand how they lived and why that powerful body both protected them and endangered them, we now have to step out of anatomy and into the economy of hunger, into the numbers the cold imposes, into the meals that had to be won again and again at close range against animals that did not want to die, because no body, however magnificent, survives on anatomy alone. Chapter 2: The Price of Staying Warm. A strong body is a hungry body. That truth follows us the moment we leave anatomy and step into daily life. If Neanderthals were among the most powerfully built humans ever to live, then they were also among the humans most tied to a demanding energy budget. Muscle uses fuel. Large body mass uses fuel. Cold uses fuel. Movement across difficult terrain uses fuel. Pregnancy uses fuel. Growth uses fuel. Recovery from illness or injury uses fuel. Firewood gathered, hides scraped, marrow extracted, children carried, carcasses butchered, and winter endured all had to be paid for in calories, and paid for again the next day, and the next, without break. There were no days off in the Ice Age, no stored surplus in a bank, no promise that tomorrow would come easier than today. That means Neanderthal survival was never built on strength alone. It was built on a constant victory over energy loss. The old romantic image of Ice Age life often mistakes cold for the main enemy. But cold by itself is only part of the problem. The real threat is cold combined with insufficient fuel. A body can survive astonishing temperatures if it has shelter, insulation, fire, and enough food to keep producing heat. Without those, the same body becomes a furnace running out of fuel, and no amount of raw muscle can rescue it once the coals inside begin to fade. For Neanderthals, this problem was almost certainly relentless. Their body design helped them conserve warmth, but maintaining that body in harsh conditions meant they had to keep eating, and not just eating anything within reach. Protein alone was not enough. This is one of the most important facts in understanding northern hunting populations, ancient or recent. Meat builds and repairs tissue, but in cold climates, a heavily meat-based diet can create problems if it lacks enough fat and, where available, other energy sources. Modern readers often imagine a successful hunt as a mountain of steaks. For an Ice Age hunter living in severe cold, the richest part of the animal might not be the muscle but the fat. Fat yields far more energy gram for gram than lean protein. It matters for heat. It matters for surviving scarcity. It matters when the body is burning calories simply to remain functional in winter conditions. Populations that eat almost pure lean meat with little fat can face a well-known metabolic problem, sometimes called protein poisoning or rabbit starvation, in which the liver and kidneys cannot handle the load. Neanderthals cannot have solved every version of this problem in every season, but their long survival suggests they understood, in practice if not in words, that fat was not a luxury. Fat was fuel. So when Neanderthals hunted large animals, they were not merely chasing flesh, they were chasing energy density. They were chasing the marrow inside the long bones. They were chasing the layers of fat beneath the hide of a horse or bison in autumn. They were chasing the internal organs, rich in nutrients that lean muscle cannot supply. And they were chasing, in a broader sense, the reliability that one large kill can give a band for several days at once, rather than the constant grind of small captures. Evidence from stable isotope studies has long supported the view that many Neanderthals occupied a high trophic level, meaning much of their dietary protein came from animal sources. In simple language, they often ate as top-level hunters do, comparable in some measurements to wolves or lions of the same landscapes. This does not mean every Neanderthal everywhere lived on exactly the same menu. Plant foods almost certainly mattered in some regions and seasons, and newer research has revealed traces of plant matter in dental calculus and residues that complicate the older stereotype of an all-meat Neanderthal. At sites in Iraq and elsewhere, researchers have found tiny fragments of cooked plants trapped in the tartar of Neanderthal teeth. Someone had gathered them, prepared them, and eaten them thousands of generations before agriculture. But the broad picture remains. Large animal foods were central in many places. That makes sense for bodies with high energy demands living in difficult climates. Now imagine what that required. A failed hunt in a modern film is suspense with a soundtrack. A failed hunt in a Neanderthal band could be a genuine threat to group stability. If several adults spent valuable energy tracking prey, approaching it, injuring it, and then lost it, the cost was not only the lost food, it was lost time, lost calories, missed opportunities elsewhere, greater exposure to cold, perhaps a new injury. The stronger the body, the more punishing that failure could become. Hunger would not have struck abstractly. It would have arrived as fatigue in the legs, slower thinking, harder decisions at dusk, weaker children, and less resilience the next time a storm rolled across the plain. And if failure repeated, the whole social fabric of the band could begin to fray. People grow short with one another when their bellies are empty. Tensions rise, errors multiply, small mistakes become fatal. This is why Neanderthal life must be understood as an economy, not a spectacle. Every activity carried a hidden ledger of gains and losses. Walking to a hunting ground cost energy. Carrying a butchered carcass cost energy. Sharing a kill within a band cost energy in the sense of trading off individual gain against group survival. But that same cost purchased something priceless in return: loyalty, reciprocity, insurance against the day when your own hunt failed and someone else's did not. A band that always kept its meat to itself would soon collapse when its luck turned. A band that shared, that watched over injured members, that fed children whose parents had failed to find food, was a band with a chance of lasting into the next generation. That is why the Shanidar 1 skeleton is so important, even here in a chapter about calories. An injured adult who cannot hunt for himself is a debt written into the group. If he lives for years after his major injuries, someone else has been paying that debt. Not once, not by accident, not out of pity in a single soft moment. Day after day, meal after meal, season after season, in a world where each additional mouth to feed can strain the group. Feeding an injured man over the long term is not a charity performance. It is a decision, or rather a habit of decisions, embedded in the culture of the band. The strongest humans who ever lived were also, in this small but crucial way, humans who knew how to keep the weak alive. The relationship between body and food shaped almost everything else. It shaped group size. A band cannot be so small that a single accident wipes out all its adult hunters, but it cannot be so large that its needs outrun the local landscape. Most estimates place Neanderthal groups somewhere in the range of a dozen to perhaps 30 individuals, though numbers surely varied. It shaped movement. Bands had to shift with the herds, following prey through the seasons rather than waiting for it to return. It shaped storage, however limited. In cold conditions, meat can be preserved for a time by freezing, drying, or burial in cold ground. It shaped conflict. Two bands sharing overlapping hunting grounds may cooperate at times, but they may also strain against each other when food thins. It shaped even the pattern of sleep, work, and rest, because a body running on a tight energy budget cannot afford wasted effort. And it shaped fire. Fire in Neanderthal life was not decoration. It was not comfort in the modern sense. It was survival infrastructure. A hearth is a place where cold meat becomes warm food, easier to eat and safer to digest. A hearth is a place where marrow can be softened and extracted. A hearth is a place where hides can be dried, tools warmed, glue melted, and children kept from freezing while adults sleep. A hearth is also a signal. Its light says, "We are here." Its smoke marks the camp. Its warmth pulls the group together every evening and every dawn. Archaeological sites across Neanderthal territory show repeated hearths, sometimes carefully placed, sometimes reused across many visits. The evidence for Neanderthal control of fire is now broad. Whether every group started fire routinely, whether some depended on capturing flames from natural sources, whether fire use was more or less consistent across regions, are still questions researchers argue about in detail. But the pattern of regular hearth use is real and long-lasting. Fire also solved a hidden problem in the energy equation. Cooking releases more usable calories from meat and, where available, from plants. It reduces the energy the body itself must spend on digestion. A group with reliable fire can extract more food value from the same kill than a group without it. Over a lifetime, that difference is enormous. Multiply it across many generations and it becomes one of the reasons humans of every kind were able to expand into environments that would otherwise have starved them. Fire is not just warmth. Fire is time added to life. Now consider clothing. There is no direct fossil garment from a Neanderthal, of course. Skins and plant fibers do not survive well over tens of thousands of years, but the indirect evidence is strong. Neanderthals butchered animals whose hides would have been useful, and their tool assemblages include many small scrapers of the kind used in later periods and in ethnographic examples to work skins. The pattern of wear on some of these tools suggests hide processing. The anatomy of Neanderthal arms shows patterns consistent with heavy, repeated scraping motion. Studies of Neanderthal humeri, the upper arm bones, suggest that scraping tasks may have been a significant, repeated activity, shaping the body from adolescence into adulthood. Whether their clothing was as tailored as later cold-weather garments made by Homo sapiens is another question. Some researchers argue that Neanderthals wore simpler wraps and cloaks rather than fitted, sewn clothing, and that this may have limited them slightly in the coldest extremes. But few doubt that some form of hide clothing existed. Without it, survival in the coldest phases would have been almost impossible even for their bodies. Combine hide, fire and food, add shelter in caves and rock shelters when available, or under lean-to structures where they were not. Add the daily social work of a small group that knew each member's strengths and weaknesses. Suddenly the picture of Neanderthal life becomes something other than a savage struggle. It becomes a system, a tight, hard working system, in which every element supported the others, and any missing piece would begin to unravel the whole. That is why any question about their extinction must eventually ask what part of the system broke. But before we can ask that question honestly, we still have more of the system to see. We have looked at bodies and calories. We have not yet stood beside a Neanderthal at the moment of a hunt. We have not yet felt the weight of a spear meant to be pushed rather than thrown. We have not yet imagined the courage and cost of closing the last few meters between a small band of humans and an animal weighing far more than all of them combined. We have not yet stood at the butchering site, hands numb, while wolves watched from the tree line and the light began to fail. Because in the Ice Age, meat was not delivered, meat charged, kicked, gored and ran, and to eat well, Neanderthals had to survive the getting. Chapter 3: Spears, Hides, and the Weight of Winter. Every meal came at a price paid in risk. In the world of a Neanderthal band, food did not sit still. It moved on hooves. It carried horns, tusks, or antlers. It weighed hundreds of kilograms, and sometimes more than a ton. It could outrun a human, outweigh a human, and injure a human with a single sudden turn. And yet, again and again, Neanderthals brought such animals down. They did so not with bows, which do not appear in the archaeological record until much later, but with heavy thrusting spears, careful positioning, and coordinated group action. Their hunting was not brute chaos. It was a craft, learned in childhood, refined in early adulthood, mastered by midlife, and taught back to the next generation. And it demanded everything they had. The tools tell part of the story. For most of their existence, Neanderthals produced a style of stone technology that archaeologists call the Mousterian, along with related industries in different regions. On first glance, Mousterian tools may seem simple: flakes struck from stone cores, scrapers, points, and denticulates worked along the edges. But look closer, and the sophistication appears. Many of the flakes were produced through a method known as the levallois technique, in which a stone core was carefully prepared in stages before the final flake was struck. That final flake had a shape planned by the toolmaker from the beginning, not left to chance. This required imagination. It required sequence. It required the ability to hold a future object in the mind while working on a present piece of stone. That is not the behavior of a creature acting only by instinct. That is craft. That is engineering, thousands of generations before the word existed. Neanderthals also selected their raw materials with care. Flint, chert, and quartzite were favored where available, prized for sharp edges and durability. At many sites, the stones used come from sources that had to be carried for considerable distances, sometimes tens of kilometers. This is not casual gathering. This is planning. It is knowledge of the landscape. It is the memory of where to find what, held across seasons and shared across generations. A Neanderthal walking with a small bundle of raw stone in his pack, days from any camp, was carrying the future of his family's winter meals in his hand. And then there is hafting. A stone point held in the hand is a knife. A stone point mounted on a wooden shaft is a spear. That transformation looks simple, but it hides an enormous technical achievement. Attaching stone to wood securely enough to survive impact requires binding, often with plant fibers or animal sinew, and adhesive. Neanderthals used birch bark tar, and the making of birch bark tar is not a happy accident. It requires heating birch bark in low oxygen conditions at controlled temperatures until the resin separates without burning. Whether Neanderthals produced this tar in simple pits, on hot stones, or with more elaborate methods is still being investigated. But the fact of production is now well established, and evidence for it stretches back well over 100,000 years. Some of the earliest secure evidence for such adhesive use in human history comes from sites associated with Neanderthals or their close ancestors. This is composite tool making. This is chemistry, in practice, long before any word for chemistry existed. Their spears were meant to work at close range. The point styles and shaft designs used in many Mousterian contexts suggest weapons that could be thrust or perhaps thrown at short distance rather than hurled across long open ground. That means Neanderthal hunters had to close with their prey. They had to accept the risk of being near an animal that did not want to die. They had to trust each other, their weapons, and the terrain that helped them narrow the distance. It also means that many of them died young, from wounds inflicted by animals whose only crime was refusing to fall on the first strike. Terrain was often the third partner in the hunt. Because Neanderthal weapons required nearness, hunters likely chose settings where their prey lost mobility or judgment. A narrow river valley that funneled a herd, a steep bank where a fleeing animal could not turn easily, a patch of thick vegetation where large bodies were slowed, a boggy edge where hooves sank. Older ideas about Neanderthals driving whole herds off cliffs in mass slaughters have not always held up under careful re-examination, and modern researchers are more cautious about such dramatic scenarios. But the basic principle is well supported. Neanderthals exploited landscape. They used what the world already offered them to reduce risk. Ambush was also part of the picture. Consider a small group of hunters waiting patiently along a route reindeer had used for years. The wind matters, the scent matters, the moment of movement matters. When the animals appear, the hunters must choose their target quickly, close the distance without being seen too soon, and drive their spears into a vital area with enough force to disable the animal. If they misjudge, the hunt fails. If they succeed but not fully, they may have to follow the wounded animal for hours or days. If they succeed cleanly, the reward is enormous. But even then, the work is only beginning. Because after the hunt comes the harder labor. Butchering a large animal is not romantic work. It is heavy, cold, bloody, and long. Skin must be separated from flesh. Muscles must be removed from bone. Organs must be sorted. Marrow must be recovered by breaking long bones open. All of this happens under pressure, because other predators, wolves, hyenas, sometimes bears, may notice the kill and try to take it. Neanderthals were not only competing with the animals they hunted, they were competing with everything else in the landscape that wanted the same food. Vultures wheeled overhead. Distant scavengers gathered on the horizon. Every hour spent at the kill was an hour when something could arrive with teeth of its own. Once the carcass was reduced, the load had to be moved. Meat is heavy. A single adult reindeer can yield tens of kilograms of usable food. A bison, wild horse, or mammoth yields far more. Carrying that meat back to a base camp, hearth, or family group was itself a serious task, especially in cold conditions when energy loss from exertion could quickly outrun the day's gain. Sometimes bands may have processed and cached meat near the kill site. Sometimes they may have moved the group to the meat rather than the meat to the group. Both strategies appear in the ethnographic record of later hunters, and both would fit the Neanderthal world. Then came the hide. A large hide meant clothing, wrapping, insulation, and possibly the material for temporary shelter. To turn it into something useful, the inside had to be cleaned of remaining flesh and fat. The material had to be worked to prevent stiffness. This is where those small scrapers appear again in Neanderthal toolkits. Scraper wear analysis and the anatomy of Neanderthal arms both suggest that hide processing was a common, repeated, labor-intensive activity, likely often carried out by adults working together over long stretches of time near a hearth. It is easy to imagine winter evenings spent this way, the scrape of stone on skin, the soft sound of a fire fed with small pieces of wood or bone, quiet voices, children moving between the adults, meat drying nearby, the steady rhythm of hands that had done this work 1,000 times before. Marrow and fat deserve their own moment. Long bones opened at the correct angle release their marrow, one of the richest sources of energy available to any Ice Age hunter. Neanderthals appear to have been very skilled at this. Cut marks and impact patterns on animal bones at their sites often show a consistent method for cracking bones to extract marrow. In some cases, they may even have heated bones to help recover remaining fat inside the porous tissues. That level of processing is not casual. It is knowledge, refined across generations. It is the difference between eating a carcass and using a carcass. And these skills traveled with them. Neanderthal sites across Europe and Western Asia show broadly consistent stone technology across enormous time. Techniques and tool types persist for thousands of years. That kind of continuity does not survive on instinct. It survives on transmission. Children must be taught. Adults must correct. Elders must remember old ways when local memory fails. The Mousterian toolkit is not just an object. It is a curriculum. Its persistence tells us that Neanderthals had reliable ways to pass knowledge from one generation to the next, in enough detail that a boy or girl grown into adulthood could reproduce the flake sequences their grandparents had used long before. Winter itself must be understood, not only as weather, but as a season of concentrated risk. In summer, prey may be abundant and varied. Small opportunities may exist. Longer days give more time for tasks. In winter, everything narrows. Days shorten. Cold deepens. Herds may migrate away or thin out. Injuries heal more slowly. Small failures compound. It is in winter that the true test of any Ice Age lifeway shows itself. Any band that reached spring alive had solved a great problem, and had solved it in cooperation. Any band that did not reach spring left behind only silence, and perhaps a scatter of bones for later archaeologists to find. And this is where a curious feature of Neanderthal life becomes clearer. Their sites often show heavy use of specific caves and rock shelters, revisited across many years. These were not one-time camps. They were places with meaning built into repetition. A cave whose hearth had heated many winters carried more than warmth. It carried memory. It was the place where such and such a child was born, where an elder had recovered from illness, where a certain hunt had been planned, where a body had been buried. In such places, the human dimension of Neanderthal life comes into focus. Not simply survival, but a way of belonging to a landscape. Not merely camping, but returning. Not merely returning, but coming home. And through all of this, the powerful body we described in Chapter 1 remains present as a silent condition. It made the close-range hunt possible. It carried heavy loads across broken ground. It withstood the strain of long butchering sessions. It endured cold that would break others. But it also demanded constant support from tools, fire, hide, group action, and shared knowledge. The body was necessary. It was not sufficient. That is why, when we begin to wonder how such a people could vanish, we must not stop at the level of muscle and stone. We have to keep looking. Into the group, into the mind, into the ways one Neanderthal knew, cared for, and remembered another. Because Ice Age survival was never a solo achievement, and neither was Ice Age loss. Chapter 4. Injured, old, and not alone. There is a special kind of evidence that changes minds. Not tools, not points, not even art. Bones that healed. When an archaeologist studies a skeleton, injuries and diseases leave clear signatures. A break in a bone that killed the person outright shows no healing at all. A break that occurred years before death shows remodeling, smoothing, the slow work of a body knitting itself back together. Between those two extremes lies a whole story. It tells us how long a person lived after being hurt, whether infection took hold, whether the injury became a lasting disability, and whether the person continued to move, eat, and belong to the group despite the damage. Bone remembers. Bone speaks. Among Neanderthals, healed injuries are common, so common that they were once used to argue those individuals must have lived violent lives, perhaps constantly grappling with dangerous game. That interpretation has softened over time. Not every injury came from combat with a bison. Some came from falls, from slips on ice, from accidents during hard labor. But the point that survives is not about the source of the injury. It is about survival after it. Take Shanidar 1 again, since we began the story with him. His remains show multiple serious injuries. His right arm was affected in a way that likely left it nearly useless, atrophied and possibly amputated below the elbow through some ancient accident. There is damage to his skull that could have affected his vision or hearing on one side. His feet and legs show signs consistent with degenerative changes. Yet the injuries had time to heal. He continued to live. Some estimates place his age at death well into the 4th or 5th decade of life, which was considerable for a Pleistocene hunter. In a hunting society without medicine as we know it, this survival is difficult to imagine without help from other people. Someone brought him food. Someone tolerated his slower pace. Someone included him in the shelter, at the hearth, in the daily rhythm of the band. Not once, not for a week, but for years. Shanidar 1 is not alone. At La Chapelle aux Saints in France, an old Neanderthal man was found whose remains have shaped a century of interpretation. This individual, sometimes called the Old Man of La Chapelle, lived into what would have been a considerable age for a Pleistocene hunter, and his skeleton shows extensive dental loss and severe arthritis. His jaw indicates that he had lost most of his teeth well before death, with the bone remodeled where the teeth had been. Chewing tough, dry meat with such a mouth would have been very difficult, yet he lived. That has led many researchers to suggest that his food was processed for him, softened, cut small, or perhaps cooked into a more edible form by others. Whether he was cared for in the tender sense we imagine today, or simply included in a group that could afford to feed him, is a question of interpretation. But the physical fact is that he did not die when his teeth did. His body kept walking after his mouth had, in the strictest sense, retired. At Krapina, in what is now Croatia, remains from a large group of Neanderthals include many individuals with injuries and, in some cases, evidence of care. The Krapina assemblage remains one of the most important collections of Neanderthal remains in the world, and it has been studied for well over a century, revealing again and again the physical reality of hard, cooperative lives. At La Ferracie in France, an entire small assemblage of Neanderthals, including children and adults, was found in what many researchers have interpreted as burials, though the details are still debated. The presence of very young individuals and older adults in one place, some in what appear to be prepared pits, suggests attention to more than immediate survival. Whoever placed those bodies did not treat them as debris. At Kibara in Israel, a Neanderthal man was buried with such care that his skeleton is unusually complete. His hyoid bone, the small, delicate structure that supports the base of the tongue, was preserved. That hyoid, and its similarity to modern human hyoids, has become part of the ongoing debate about Neanderthal speech, and we will return to it in the next chapter. Whatever it means for language, it also means something for burial. Someone placed his body in a way that protected its parts from being scattered by scavengers or time. These are not isolated cases. Across the Neanderthal world, we find repeated patterns of individuals who lived long after events that should have killed them, and of bodies treated in ways that go beyond simple abandonment. The details differ, the scale differs, but the general shape of the evidence is consistent enough that most researchers now accept, at minimum, that Neanderthals often cared for injured and aging members of their groups, and that they sometimes handled the dead deliberately. This care is more than a heartwarming story. It is a survival strategy. A group that keeps its old members alive keeps its knowledge alive. An elder who has lost his teeth may still remember where a certain herd crossed the river 40 winters ago, or how to prepare an unusual root for eating, or what a particular sound at night means in the darkness. A woman who has passed the years of childbearing may still be the most skilled hide worker in the band, the one who trains the young. A hunter with a damaged arm may still teach children how to prepare a spear shaft, how to read tracks, how to sit still in cold weather. Knowledge does not fit only in strong bodies. It fits in the bodies that have lived long enough to gather it. Take away the elders, and you take away the map. Neanderthal life expectancy was harsh. Many did not reach what we would consider old age. But when individuals did survive, they carried immense value to the group. That value would have made caring for them logical as well as emotional. To feed an elder is to feed a memory. To protect a wounded hunter is to preserve a teacher. To burn a hearth beside a sick child is to defend the future. Now consider what such care requires. It requires the ability to imagine another being's state, to recognize pain in a face, to adjust action according to another person's condition, to share food with the understanding that later another might share with you, to wait, to include, to tolerate lower productivity from a member because of what that member still contributes in other ways. These are not automatic behaviors. They are cognitive and emotional habits, held by a culture, transmitted across generations, and reinforced by daily practice. Their existence in Neanderthal life is one of the strongest arguments against the older image of them as unfeeling brutes. Care also existed within families, though we cannot draw specific family trees from bones. We can, however, see the general contour. Children who were born vulnerable and helpless in a cold world had to be carried, nursed, warmed, and protected for years. Any adult who could not tolerate this would not have raised offspring. Any group whose adults could not cooperate in child raising would have lost its future. The mothers, aunts, older siblings, and possibly fathers and other men in the band would all have contributed in some way. The exact division of labor is unclear, but the fact of shared childcare can be inferred from the simple mathematics of survival. A single mother in the Ice Age could not have raised a healthy child without help, and so help must have existed, again and again, in ways we can no longer directly see, but must acknowledge to be true. Older women likely mattered in particular ways. In many later hunter-gatherer societies, women who no longer bear children often become critical contributors of gathered food, processing, childcare, and knowledge transmission. There is no direct evidence that Neanderthals matched any modern group in detail, but the general principle of intergenerational contribution is hard to avoid. In a small, energy-stressed band, the presence of one or two older adults with deep knowledge of local plants, prey behavior, or seasonal patterns could tip the balance between hunger and survival. This vision of Neanderthal life carries a certain quiet dignity. They were not perfect. Injuries and violence show that their world could be harsh, even between individuals. Infant mortality was likely high. Disease could sweep through small groups. Winters could break bands beyond repair. But within that hard world, Neanderthals were also capable of tenderness, in the practical sense. They fed injured adults. They kept old people alive. They handled the dead in ways that suggest thought, and possibly meaning, beyond raw disposal. They lived, in many respects, as we would recognize the deepest patterns of human social life. The dead themselves are perhaps the most sensitive evidence, and we should treat them carefully. Whether Neanderthals practiced burial in a formal sense is still debated in specifics. At some sites, individuals are found in pits that seem too neat to be accidents. At others, the association of the body with soft sediments, particular positions, or specific parts of the site suggests deliberate placement. Some scholars remain cautious, arguing that not every apparent burial is what it seems, and that natural processes can imitate deliberate treatment. Others argue that the pattern across many sites is too consistent to be dismissed. What can be said with confidence is that at least in several cases, the treatment of the dead by Neanderthals appears intentional and different from the abandonment that would be expected if they had no cultural response to death. That distinction is important. The moment a group decides that a body should not simply be left where it fell, but should be moved, positioned, or covered, something has crossed a threshold. Not necessarily religion, not necessarily belief in an afterlife, but at least an emotional or social recognition that a dead member of the group is not just another object in the landscape. Neanderthals do not have to have believed in gods for their burials, if that is what they were, to matter. It is enough that they treated the dead differently than they treated the trash of a butchering site. Some sites hint at more. At Shanidar, later work has suggested careful placement of certain bodies. The famous flower burial claim, based on pollen found in the sediments, has attracted controversy for decades. Some researchers argue that the pollen was introduced by burrowing animals or other natural processes, and that the flowers were not deliberately placed. Others argue that the pattern of pollen clumps still suggests some intentional connection to the body. The safest conclusion is that the flower burial remains contested, but the pattern of care in the treatment of dead individuals at Shanidar as a whole is still striking. More recent work at Shanidar has continued to reveal remains in positions that raise similar questions, and the debate is not closed. At La Chapelle aux Saints, the old man appears to have been placed in a shallow, prepared depression, which many researchers regard as evidence of a deliberate burial. At La Ferracie, the arrangement of several individuals raises similar questions. Whatever the exact rituals or beliefs, the picture that emerges is one of a species that did not experience death casually. Individuals mattered enough that their end was marked by more than the simple work of scavengers and time. That leaves us with a Neanderthal world that is much closer, emotionally, to ours than the caricature suggested. They were bodies that healed. They were groups that cared. They were minds that could imagine what another being needed. They were memories that outlived teeth. They were hearths that warmed both the strong and the injured. They were people, in every sense we would recognize. But how did they carry all of this? How did they teach the young, remember the old, plan the hunt, warn each other of danger, and hold together across generations without the tools of a written language? For that, we must turn to voices we cannot fully hear, and to a debate about speech that has divided scholars for a century. Chapter 5: The Voice We Cannot Hear. There is one sense in which Neanderthals will always remain silent to us. We cannot hear their voices. Sound does not fossilize. No tape, no scratched cylinder, no clay tablet with pressed vowels can survive from a world so ancient. Whatever Neanderthals said to one another when the fire crackled, or when a child cried at night, we cannot recover. Their language, if it was a language, is gone. It sank into the same silence that swallows every unrecorded human word. But that does not mean the question is closed. For more than a century, researchers have looked for indirect signs of speech in Neanderthal remains, and the search has led into one of the most difficult debates in all of paleoanthropology, one that keeps circling back on itself, because the evidence is fragmentary and the stakes are enormous. If Neanderthals could speak in a way like ours, then almost everything we imagine about them changes. If they could not, then their entire social life must be reinterpreted through other channels. The earliest arguments were built on the shape of the skull and the base of the throat. Older reconstructions of Neanderthal skulls suggested that their vocal tracts might have been positioned in a way that limited certain vowel sounds. Some researchers argued that this made complex speech impossible. Others disagreed. In the following decades, more remains were found, more measurements taken, more models built, and the harshest older claims began to soften. It became clear that at least some Neanderthal anatomy was compatible with a broad range of vocal sounds. Then, in the 1980s, a small but crucial discovery arrived. At Kebara Cave, in what is now Israel, researchers uncovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal man. Among the preserved bones was a hyoid, that small horseshoe-shaped bone in the neck that supports the base of the tongue. The Kebara II hyoid looked strikingly similar in shape to the hyoids of modern humans. Later analyses of the bone's internal structure suggested that it had been used in ways consistent with speech-related tongue and throat movement. That was, and remains, a powerful piece of evidence, though it is not proof of language in the full modern sense. Anatomy compatible with speech is not the same as syntax, grammar, storytelling, or the specific cognitive architecture of language as we know it. Cautious researchers still note that even if Neanderthals could physically produce sounds like ours, we cannot show for certain that they used those sounds in the same complex, symbolic way. But the balance of evidence has shifted. Where once it was fashionable to say Neanderthals could not speak, it is now more common to say that they very likely had some form of vocal communication that was more than a limited set of grunts. Genetic evidence adds another layer, though it must be handled with care. Certain genes associated in modern humans with speech and language, including the well-known FOXP2 gene, have been found in ancient DNA from Neanderthals in forms not entirely unlike ours. The exact significance of this is debated. Genes are not a simple switch for language, but the fact that Neanderthals were not lacking major elements of the genetic toolkit associated with speech in humans is one more reason to lean toward the view that they could communicate in complex ways. Their ears also matter. Studies of the delicate bones of the Neanderthal inner ear and reconstructions of the outer canal suggest that they had hearing sensitivity in ranges very similar to those most useful for perceiving human speech. In other words, their ears were tuned to sounds that voice-producing organs like theirs could make. That parallel is not a coincidence. It suggests that speaking and listening evolved together in their lineage, as in ours. Now, consider what their lives would have required. A Mousterian tool tradition maintained across many generations, composite tools with adhesive that require multi-step production, hunts of very large animals that demanded coordination in real time, care for injured members across years, movement across broad landscapes with knowledge of routes, seasons, and dangers, possibly the treatment of the dead in ways that carry emotional weight. None of these behaviors requires poetry, but all of them require communication rich enough to teach, plan, warn, correct, and remember. Some of that communication may have taken forms other than speech: gesture, facial expression, demonstration, song, rhythmic sound, whistles or calls that carried across open ground. But it is difficult to imagine such a life without at least a fairly complex spoken component. Even if their language was less flexible than ours, or built differently, it must have been able to name things, mark relationships, and share plans across time. And this brings us back to the hearth. Imagine a small band gathered in the mouth of a cave in late winter. The fire is low but steady. Adults sit around it, working. One woman scrapes a hide with a small stone tool. A man mends a spear shaft, testing the binding. Children lean against older siblings, half asleep. Voices move gently. Someone tells the others about a place seen days ago where hoofprints crossed a stream. Someone else responds. A child asks something and is answered. An older person, perhaps toothless, watches, listens, and remembers. We cannot know what language they used, but it is very hard to look at all we know about their lives and imagine no language at all. Their world was too complex, their behaviors too coordinated, their culture too continuous for silence. Speech carries something even beyond information. It carries identity. Any group with speech has ways of marking who belongs and who does not, who is a child of this band and who is a stranger, who is trusted and who is uncertain. It carries humor, complaint, comfort. It carries names. Whether Neanderthals used names as we do is unknown, but the sheer intimacy of their long-lasting groups suggests that individuals within them were recognized as unique. A woman was not just another female. She was this particular person, with this particular life, remembered by others. Speech also allows shared imagination. To plan a hunt, one has to describe places not currently visible. To teach a child how to work stone, one has to talk about a future object hidden inside a present rock. To pass down the story of an ancestor who died in a great winter storm, one has to make the absent present in words. All of this is possible only through language, in some form. If Neanderthals lived the lives we have been describing, then they almost certainly shared imagination as well. Their minds could hold the not present, the not now, the not yet. That is one of the deepest features of human cognition, and there is little reason to keep excluding them from it. Still, we must resist making them into simple copies of ourselves. Their language may have differed from ours in ways we cannot easily reconstruct. Their conversations may have been shorter or organized around different themes. Their storytelling, if it existed, may have taken forms alien to modern narrative. The fact that we cannot recover any of this is a loss, and we should mark it clearly. Not everything unrecoverable was unimportant. The debate about Neanderthal speech is therefore not simply about whether they could make sounds. It is about how much of human inner life they shared with us. The trend in the evidence has been away from the harsher denials of the past. It has moved toward a picture in which Neanderthals had a rich communicative life, likely involving speech, though we cannot fully specify its structure. The importance of this cannot be overstated for our larger question, because if Neanderthals had language, then their extinction cannot be explained by any simple story about them lacking the ability to talk. Something else, or many things, must have gone wrong. Their voices, whatever they sounded like, did not fail them for lack of complexity. They failed only in the sense that eventually no more voices called out from those particular hearths. To understand why, we must move even further into their minds. Because these people did more than talk, work, and survive. They made choices that had nothing to do with immediate survival at all. They collected, they marked, they arranged, they dug deep into caves in darkness, for reasons that still puzzle us. And in doing so, they took the last major step that would place them fully within the human family. Chapter 6. Talons, Ochre, and Deep Caves. At some point in Neanderthal history, they began to do things that did not directly keep them alive. That is a small sentence with a large meaning. Every animal on Earth spends most of its time on survival. Every human on Earth spends much of its time on survival too, but humans also do other things. They decorate, they collect, they arrange, they mark, they perform. They visit places for reasons that cannot be explained by food, warmth, or safety alone. These behaviors are often called symbolic, though the word is imperfect. What they share is a step beyond the immediate. They imply that the world has meaning in addition to use. For a long time, symbolic behavior was reserved by scholarly consensus for Homo sapiens. Neanderthals were described as lacking it, or as showing only the most limited hints. That picture has changed steadily, and today it is difficult to maintain the older exclusion. The evidence has grown too broad. Consider the eagle talons. At Krapina, in what is now Croatia, and at several other sites across Europe, including in Spain and Italy, researchers have identified eagle talons that show cut marks made by stone tools. These marks are not the accidental scars of butchering a whole animal. They are precise, placed at the points where a talon could be separated from the rest of the foot, and, in some cases, mounted or strung, where patterns on some talons suggest that they may indeed have been assembled into what could reasonably be called ornaments, necklaces, bracelets, attachments to clothing or hair. The exact meanings of such ornaments are lost, but their existence is not accidental. Someone chose to remove those talons carefully, working around the small bones with skill, and to preserve them for reasons that had nothing to do with food. Eagle meat is not the main goal here, the claw is. Similar evidence appears with feathers. At several sites, cut marks on the wing bones of large birds suggest the removal of feathers. Feathers are of little food value. Their most likely use, then, as later in human history, was decorative or symbolic. Whether they marked status, identity, group membership, or something we cannot name, they existed at least in part for meaning. Then there is pigment. Across a wide range of Neanderthal sites, small quantities of red ochre and other colouring minerals appear repeatedly. Ochre is a natural iron oxide. It can produce red, yellow, and brown colours depending on preparation. It has been used by many later human groups for body painting, hide preparation, ritual, and art. Its presence at Neanderthal sites in itself is not conclusive proof of symbolic use. Ochre can also have practical roles, in tanning or hafting, for example. But at some sites, the quantity, the form, and the association with other unusual materials strongly suggest that its use extended beyond the strictly practical. Someone gathered it, someone stored it, someone applied it somewhere, and whatever the exact purpose, it was worth carrying and keeping. Then came the caves. In 2018, a study using uranium-thorium dating on cave art in 3 sites in Spain reported ages older than the earliest known arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe. The paintings in question, at La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales, included simple lines, hand stencils, and geometric marks. Their dates pushed the origin of the art back into a period when, according to the current understanding, only Neanderthals were present in that region. The interpretation is not without debate. Dating cave art is difficult. Some scholars have questioned the exact ages or the association of the dated material with the paintings themselves. But the study was serious, published in a major venue, and its results have to be reckoned with. If Neanderthals made even some of that art, then they crossed a line that once was drawn firmly around modern humans. They picked up pigment. They faced a stone wall in a dark, echoing chamber. They pressed a hand or dragged a mark. They marked the world with intention. That is not survival. That is a species declaring, in whatever silent language it commanded, that it existed. Even more startling is Bruniquel Cave in France. Deep inside this cave, hundreds of meters from the entrance, past passages that require lights and effort to reach, lies a strange structure. It is not decoration. It is not a hearth for cooking, although it includes traces of burning. It is a set of ring-shaped constructions built from broken stalagmites and stalactites, arranged in the darkness. The pieces were deliberately broken, deliberately placed. The largest ring is several meters across. Smaller structures and burnt patches lie nearby. Around 400 pieces of stone, carefully snapped and moved, gathered into these formal shapes. The age of the Bruniquel construction has been dated to around 176,000 years ago, well within the range when only Neanderthals are known to have lived in that part of the world. That means Neanderthals, in complete darkness, deep beneath the surface, gathered materials and built something that had no obvious survival purpose. They did not do this in a moment of casual play. They did it with light, presumably fire, carried into the depths. They did it with coordination. They did it with patience. And they did it in a place that seems chosen precisely because it was hidden. We do not know what those rings meant. Ritual gathering, ceremony, test of courage, practice ground for something. Any of these interpretations, and others, are possible. What can be said with confidence is that this was not survival. This was culture in the strong sense. This was choice arriving from within, not from without. This was a small group of humans, more than 170,000 years ago, walking into darkness for a reason we can no longer name, but can no longer deny. Once we accept the possibility of Neanderthal symbolic behavior, other pieces of the record start to make more sense. The care in the treatment of some of their dead, the consistency of certain hearth and camp arrangements, the presence of unusual objects like large crystals or strangely colored stones at some sites, brought from elsewhere but not obviously used, the persistent presence of pigments where they cannot be neatly explained, even certain patterns in tool-making that seem to go beyond function into something more. Each of these details, taken alone, could be explained away. Together, they build a picture, a species that increasingly appears to have shared, at least in part, our human tendency to find or make meaning. This raises a question that touches the whole documentary. If Neanderthals had care work, likely speech, and symbolic behavior, then how, in the end, are they truly different from us? The most honest answer is that the differences are real but subtler than earlier generations of scholars believed. Their bodies differed. Their tool traditions were, on average, more conservative across time than the later technologies of Homo sapiens. Their networks may have been smaller and more local. Their symbolic expression, while present, does not seem to have accumulated in the same broad, escalating way that produced, for example, the great cave paintings of Chauvet or Lascaux at scales unmatched in the Neanderthal record. Their culture appears to have been slower to change, though this may reflect stability rather than incapacity. Their populations were probably always thinner on the ground than the expanding groups of modern humans who came from Africa. Yet the gulf between them and us is not the abyss the old textbooks described. They stand within the human circle, not outside it. They stand with a different accent, a different profile, a different rhythm, but they stand with us. Any story of their extinction must therefore treat them as fellow humans in the full moral sense. Their disappearance is not the natural retirement of a lesser thing. It is the loss of another way of being human. That is a very different weight to carry. And once we accept that weight, the next chapter becomes both more painful and more necessary, because it is time to enter the central mystery of this documentary, not their strength, not their tools, not their care, but the exact edge of their disappearance, the narrow band of time when the world tilted and their way of life could no longer hold. Chapter 7. A world that changed too fast. For a long time, the disappearance of the Neanderthals was told as a duel. On one side, the strong but crude Neanderthal. On the other, the clever, adaptable Homo sapiens arriving from Africa. In this old story, our ancestors simply outcompeted or outfought the older residents of Europe and Western Asia. It was a story of replacement, sometimes even of violent conquest. It fit a narrative of progress in which one species stepped aside for another that was somehow better. It made for an easy documentary. It also, we now understand, oversimplified almost everything. The central revelation of Neanderthal research over the past 2 decades is not that Homo sapiens replaced them. It is that no single cause replaced them. Their disappearance is best understood as a cascade of overlapping pressures, arriving at a time when Neanderthal populations were already thinly stretched. Climate, demography, ecology, genetics, and contact with modern humans all played roles, and no single factor is enough on its own. Their fall was not a single blow. It was 1,000 small tilts, arriving together in a season that could not absorb them. Start with climate. Neanderthals had lived through many cold periods and even many warm ones. They had endured glacial phases when much of Europe was hostile, and interglacial phases when forests grew where steppe had been. In one sense, they were experts at cold. Their bodies suggested it, their tools suggested it, their long presence proved it. But climate in the late Pleistocene, especially in the tens of thousands of years leading up to their disappearance, was not simply cold, it was unstable. Between roughly 70,000 and 40,000 years ago, the climate of Europe swung repeatedly. Some of these swings, associated with what scientists call Dansgaard-Oeschger and Heinrich events, produced sharp changes in temperature and vegetation within very short periods, sometimes only decades. Grasslands turned to woodlands, woodlands back to open steppe, or even to near-desert conditions in some regions, and then reversed again. Ice cores from Greenland record these changes with astonishing precision, layer by layer. Sediment cores from lakes and oceans confirm them. Their effects on the ground would have included shifts in prey migration, in plant availability, in the risk of storms, in the timing of seasons, and in the reliability of long-known survival strategies. Neanderthals had inherited a way of life adapted to particular kinds of Ice Age conditions. When the world stayed within certain bounds, their bodies, tools, and knowledge could keep them fed. But when conditions started to shift more rapidly than any single generation could remember, the accumulated wisdom of their culture became less reliable. The place where the herd used to cross was no longer the place. The plants that used to grow along a certain riverbank did not appear that spring. The winter that used to last a certain number of months stretched longer or ended in freak thaws. The old maps in the elders' heads slowly stopped matching the ground. None of these changes was necessarily fatal on its own, but over decades and centuries, they could grind down a small population that lacked the extra flexibility to adjust. Now add the second pressure, demography. Genetic analysis of ancient DNA, especially from remains found at Chagirskaya Cave in Siberia and other sites, has revealed something crucial. Late Neanderthal populations were small. They lived in scattered groups, often numbering in the tens rather than the hundreds. Their genetic diversity was low, which is a strong sign of long-term small population sizes. Analysis of some Neanderthal remains has suggested that individuals were often related to others in their group in ways that indicate limited contact between neighboring bands. In some cases, close kinship patterns in the DNA suggest groups so small that partners were sometimes drawn from among close relatives. Small populations have well-known vulnerabilities. They lose genetic diversity over time, which can reduce their ability to adapt to new diseases or environmental pressures. They accumulate harmful mutations more easily. Random events, a bad hunting season, a disease outbreak, a winter that kills a few key adults, can wipe out entire local groups without any external cause. And when local groups are far apart, and contact between them is thin, one group cannot easily rescue another by sharing food, partners, or knowledge. If Neanderthals had already spent tens of thousands of years in relatively small, scattered populations, then their capacity to absorb shocks was less than it might once have been. They were a body of humans, but a stretched, thin body, spread across a huge continent in small circles of light, with long, dark distances between one hearth and the next. Add the third pressure, the arrival of Homo sapiens. Modern humans, our own species, entered Europe and other parts of Eurasia over a long period, in waves, from Africa, and through the Levant. By roughly 45,000 years ago, they were increasingly present in territories that had long been Neanderthal ground. The details of these movements are complicated. There is no single simple date, no single route, no single moment of arrival. But, by the tens of thousands of years leading up to the disappearance of the Neanderthals, our ancestors were in the same landscapes. The two species overlapped in time and place. This is now certain. They also, in some cases, interbred. That too is certain, and we will return to it in the next chapter. Direct violence between them is possible in individual encounters, and probably occurred at least sometimes, but there is no clear archaeological evidence of a continent-wide war of extermination. Instead, competition seems to have been mostly ecological. Both species hunted many of the same animals. Both used similar landscapes. Both needed calories from the same limited pool. Where Homo sapiens differed, and where they may have held an edge, was less in body than in network. Modern humans in Europe often show archaeological signs of long-distance connections. Materials, ideas, and possibly people moved across broader distances. Ornaments, techniques, and styles appear across large areas, suggesting communication and exchange between many groups. When one region ran into trouble, others might have supplied support, mates, or new ideas. Small, more isolated Neanderthal groups may not have had this same web to lean on. Combine the three pressures: a world where the climate stopped being predictable, a population already small and thinly spread, a new competitor with slightly different toolkits, larger social networks, and its own drive to expand. Layer over that any local disaster, disease, harsh season, or bad luck. It is not difficult to see how the balance could tip. There are also debates about specific factors that may have made the tipping easier. Some researchers argue that the last Neanderthal population suffered from higher rates of inbreeding, which reduced fertility and increased illness. Others suggest that a large volcanic eruption in southern Italy around 39,000 years ago, the Campanian ignimbrite, may have disrupted ecosystems in southern Europe just at the wrong time. Others focus on differences in child-raising practices, technology of clothing, or hunting strategies. Each of these is an area of active research and honest disagreement. What is clear is that the last Neanderthal populations did not fall in one clean stroke. They faded in different times and different places. Their retreat in some regions may have been into refuges of milder climate. In places such as the southern Iberian Peninsula, southern Italy, and parts of the Balkans, where conditions remained more favorable for longer. In these last stands, they may have persisted for several thousand additional years after their disappearance from other regions. But the trend, once begun, could not be reversed. Small populations became smaller, territories shrank, contact between groups thinned. Somewhere between roughly 45,000 and 40,000 years ago, according to the current dating evidence, the last Neanderthal bands as recognizable populations died out. There is something quiet and terrible about that ending. There was no final battle to record, no last citadel to name, no dying speech captured for posterity. Just the slow reduction of hearths across a continent. A cave in southern Spain where a fire once burned regularly, and then, some year, was not lit again. A river valley in the Balkans where a hunting group had used the same routes for generations, and then, some season, stopped appearing. A rock shelter in the Zagros where the last Neanderthal child grew up, aged, and died without others of her kind to take her place. Somewhere, a final voice, in a language we will never hear, spoke a final word we will never know. And then the silence that had been gathering for thousands of years closed over the last of them. And yet, in a strange and deeply important sense, the story does not end there. because the Neanderthals did not vanish without leaving something behind. They left more than tools and bones. They left something inside us. And to understand that, we must turn from the story of loss to the story of unexpected inheritance. Chapter 8. The DNA that would not die. For most of the 20th century, the possibility that living humans might carry Neanderthal ancestry seemed remote. The two forms were often described as separate species, and separate species were assumed not to leave lasting genetic contributions when they met. Even when interbreeding was considered, it was often dismissed as either impossible or so rare as to be irrelevant. Then, in 2010, that assumption collapsed. A team led by Svante Paabo at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, working with international collaborators, published the first draft of the Neanderthal genome. The work was based on bone fragments from several individuals, especially from Vindija Cave in Croatia, and on a comparison with the genomes of modern humans from around the world. The results changed the field. People today whose ancestry lies outside sub-Saharan Africa were shown to carry a small but real percentage of Neanderthal DNA, typically in the range of a couple of %. Later refinements adjusted the numbers and details, but the central finding held. Interbreeding had happened. Neanderthal genes had entered the human family and had never entirely left. This discovery was more than a technical achievement. It changed the emotional weight of the whole story. Neanderthals were no longer simply another extinct hominin. They were now, in a genetic sense, part of us. Their DNA sat inside living cells, spread across every continent where non-African populations later moved. If they had vanished as a distinct people, they had not vanished as a lineage. Their thread had been braided into ours. Then came Denny. In 2018, researchers analyzing a small bone fragment from Denisova Cave in Siberia identified a young female whose genome contained a striking pattern. Her mother had been Neanderthal. Her father had been Denisovan, another ancient human group known primarily from that same cave and from later genetic traces in some living populations. This individual, sometimes nicknamed Denny, was the first known direct offspring of two different ancient human groups. She lived and died in a world where more than one kind of human still walked the earth, and where at least occasionally they met and had children together. Her discovery could not have been more powerful. It meant that ancient human groups were not sealed off from each other, but that the boundaries between them had been crossed by real people in real encounters, whose lives left traces we can still read. The implications for how we imagine Neanderthal contact with modern humans are significant. If Neanderthals could meet and have children with Denisovans in Central Asia, and if Neanderthals could meet and have children with modern humans in various regions where their ranges overlapped, then encounters between these groups were not necessarily always violent or hostile. Sometimes they were intimate, sometimes they resulted in offspring, sometimes those offspring lived long enough and had children of their own, so that Neanderthal DNA moved into the wider stream of humanity that spread across the rest of the world. Real history rarely allows for a single tone. There were probably tense meetings, fearful ones, curious ones, aggressive ones, kind ones, awkward, half-understood ones. Whatever happened at each meeting, some fraction resulted in shared descendants. That is the only reason the DNA is still there. The Neanderthal contribution to modern genomes is not spread evenly across our DNA. Certain regions of our genome are enriched with Neanderthal-derived variants. Others are largely empty of them. Selection over the last tens of thousands of years appears to have kept some Neanderthal variants and removed others. Among the areas most affected are genes related to skin and hair, immune response, metabolism, and adaptation to environments outside Africa. In some cases, Neanderthal variants may have helped modern humans as they moved into new climates and encountered new pathogens. Certain immune system genes inherited from Neanderthals may have offered protection against diseases that modern humans first encountered after leaving Africa. In other cases, Neanderthal variants may be associated with increased risk of certain conditions in the modern world. The picture is complex, and research continues. But the deeper cultural fact is simpler. When people today speak of Neanderthals as if they were an outside curiosity, they do so slightly against their own genome. For most people whose recent ancestry is outside sub-Saharan Africa, the Neanderthals are not another species walked past. They are a part of the family tree, not the whole trunk, and not even a large branch, but a real branch. Their genes live on in our blood, our skin, our lungs, our nights and days. There is something almost tender about that inheritance. The strongest humans who ever lived did not vanish into complete darkness. Their bones lie in the earth, their tools rest in museum drawers, their hearths are cold, but their DNA still divides in cells every day. Their fingerprint is still on the door of our biology. When a modern child is born, a small part of what she inherits is written by ancestors who once knelt in a European rock shelter and sharpened a stone by firelight 30,000 years ago. The story of their disappearance therefore needs a new frame. They did not vanish in the absolute sense we once imagined. They disappeared as a distinct visible population. They stopped having their own hearths and their own tool traditions and their own separate history, but they were absorbed into ours in a small and real way. The final Neanderthals may not have known this was happening. They cannot have understood that their children with Homo sapiens partners would carry them across future continents. They only lived their lives. They only made the choices they could make. Yet the result was that they became part of the human future they did not live to see. This is not a story of noble sacrifice. It is not a story of a chosen exit. It is a story of what happens when two closely related human forms meet in a world that could no longer support them both as separate lineages. The one whose network was smaller, whose numbers were thinner, whose local specialization had less room to adjust, faded. The other continued and grew. But in the meeting between them, a strand of the older one was kept, without any plan or intention, simply because two people spent one night together, or one season, and had a child. That kind of history is uncomfortable, because it does not fit heroic narratives. It is not the story of one people conquering another. It is not the story of a nobly resisting last band. It is the story of small, human-scale contacts, repeated many times, in many places, across thousands of years, whose combined result was that when the Neanderthals as a whole disappeared, a small fraction of them remained inside the people who lived on. Their inheritance survived. Their culture, in the fullest sense, did not. The Mousterian tool tradition ended. The hearths of Shanidar and La Chapelle and Krapina and Brunichel grew cold. The knowledge accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years about specific herds, specific rivers, specific plants, specific hunts, disappeared with the last speakers who could pass it on. Whatever songs they may have sung, whatever names they gave their children, whatever stories they told beside their fires, all of that is gone. Only the genes remain, and even those tell us only what natural selection allowed to persist. Yet even this partial survival is remarkable. Most species that go extinct leave nothing but bones and, if we are lucky, a few artifacts. The Neanderthals left more. They left a living presence inside another human population. They left a way of being human that partially crossed the extinction line and rejoined the stream of history in the bodies of people who have no idea, most of the time, that they are carrying it. And in that small survival, there is a quiet question about our own place in the story. If we carry them inside us, then their history is not entirely separate from ours. Their strength, their care, their symbolic acts, their errors, their eventual disappearance, all these are, in some measure, part of the family history of the modern human species. We do not have to invent an emotional connection to them. It is written into us at a level below thought that places a certain responsibility on how we tell their story, not to romanticize them, not to insult them, not to reduce them to caricatures on either side, but to see them as they were, as far as we can, and to acknowledge that when we look at their remains, we are looking at relatives. The next chapter will step back from that intimacy for a moment and consider the broader context. What did their world look like as they were disappearing? How did the environment, the wider community of other species, and the arc of the late Pleistocene as a whole shape their end? Because their disappearance was not only their own event, it happened inside a larger story of change that we are only beginning to understand fully. Chapter 9. The Long Twilight of an Ice Age World. The last Neanderthals did not disappear into a stable world. They disappeared into a world that was itself changing. The late Pleistocene, the period of tens of thousands of years leading up to the end of the last major glacial phase, was a time of enormous shifts. The great ice sheets that had covered parts of northern Europe advanced and retreated. Coastlines moved. Rivers changed course. Vast ecosystems appeared, transformed and disappeared. Many other species, not just Neanderthals, faced pressures that would eventually push some of them into extinction as well. Cave bears, woolly rhinoceroses, mammoths, cave lions, giant deer. These animals, which had shared the Neanderthal world for hundreds of thousands of years, were themselves entering their own long twilights, though most of them held on longer than the Neanderthals did. Understanding the Neanderthal end therefore means understanding it as part of a broader ecological turning point. The mammoth steppe, that vast cold grassland that had stretched across northern Eurasia through the coldest phases of the Ice Age, was slowly beginning to fragment. It would not fully disappear until later, but the conditions that supported it were becoming less stable. Grasslands broke into patches, forests advanced in some regions. Wetter conditions altered the landscape in ways that changed which animals thrived where. For Neanderthals, whose way of life depended heavily on large, open landscape prey, these changes would have mattered. The reindeer herds that had crossed familiar valleys for centuries might now cross elsewhere or come in smaller numbers. The horses and bison that had grazed a certain steppe might find their pasture broken up by encroaching trees. Even the smaller changes in vegetation could ripple through the food chain in ways that affected the size, timing, and reliability of Neanderthal hunts. This is not to say that Neanderthals were incapable of adapting. They had adapted before. Their long presence itself proves that. But the pace and combination of changes in this final period may have exceeded what their more local knowledge systems could handle without disruption. At the same time, other predators were pressing on the ecosystem. Wolves, cave hyenas, bears, lions. All of these animals competed with Neanderthals for prey and, in some cases, for shelter. A cave that could house a Neanderthal family could also house a cave bear during hibernation. The archaeological evidence sometimes shows layers of use in which humans and large carnivores alternated in the same shelters over centuries. In an environment where large game was becoming less predictable, competition with these other predators would have grown more consequential. Then there is the human competitor. We have already discussed Homo sapiens as a factor, but it is worth pausing on the shape of their expansion. Modern humans did not simply arrive and immediately outcompete Neanderthals. Their spread was uneven, sometimes slow, sometimes rapid, with pockets of overlap that lasted thousands of years. In some regions, they may have coexisted with Neanderthals for longer than in others. Some archaeological sites show layers with tools attributed to Neanderthals overlain by layers with tools attributed to modern humans, sometimes with only a short time gap between them. In this long twilight, the two human forms were probably aware of each other in ways we can barely reconstruct. They may have seen each other across a valley. They may have noticed each other's tracks. They may have found evidence of each other's camps after the other had moved on. Their reactions must have varied, ranging from fear to curiosity to open contact, depending on the individuals and circumstances. Some sites in this transitional period show a mixing of technological styles. The so-called Châtelperronian industry in parts of France, and other transitional industries elsewhere in Europe, has been the subject of long debate. Some researchers argue that these industries were made by Neanderthals influenced by contact with early modern humans. Others argue that they were made by modern humans, or that the picture is confused by mixing of layers. The truth may vary from site to site. What is important for our story is that in the final centuries and millennia of the Neanderthal world, cultural boundaries may have been becoming less rigid, at least in some places, even as biological boundaries were slowly closing. Whatever the details, the overall pattern is clear. The Neanderthal world was ending inside a larger transition. Consider the demography of that ending. If the last Neanderthal groups were small, then they lived in a world where they might rarely see another band of their own kind. A young Neanderthal woman might grow up knowing only the people she was born among. Finding a mate might require rare, difficult journeys. Some groups may have gone generations without renewing contact with distant relatives. This isolation would have magnified every other pressure. In some regions, the last Neanderthals lived in refuges. Southern Europe offered some of the mildest conditions, sheltered from the harshest expressions of climatic instability farther north. The southern Iberian Peninsula, southern Italy, and parts of the Balkans have all been discussed as possible late refuges, where Neanderthal populations may have persisted for longer than in colder regions. These refuges have a certain melancholy in the archaeology. They are places where, for a while, the old way of life continued, while other regions had already fallen silent. In a cave in southern Spain, generations of Neanderthals may have watched their world grow smaller. Their hunting territories may have narrowed, their memories of other bands may have grown thinner, and still they lit their hearths, still they raised their children, still they buried their dead when they could, in ways their ancestors would have recognized. Then, eventually, they too were gone. The last of them may not have known they were the last. That is one of the hardest thoughts in the Neanderthal story. Extinction is often described as a dramatic event, but for its participants it usually is not. It is a slow decline, invisible in the immediate moment. A hunter 30,000 years ago in Iberia would not have known that his people were on the edge. He would only have known that game was thinner some seasons, that his group was smaller than his grandfather's group had been, that certain valleys no longer produced the food they once had. He would not have named his moment. He would only have lived it. There is no evidence that the Neanderthals foresaw their end, nor is there evidence that they resisted it in any coordinated way. How could they have? They had no way to see the pattern from above. They only had the ground under their feet and the sky over their heads. They only had the memory of their elders and the hopes for their children. And yet, in a way, their whole cultural life was a form of holding on. The Mousterian toolkit persisted for such an immense span, partly because it worked, and partly because keeping it going was itself an act of continuity. Their care for the injured, their treatment of the dead, their hearths in familiar caves, all of these were ways of holding the group together against the pressures of a hard world. In the final phase, all of that would have carried on until it simply could not anymore. Small groups have limits. When too few adults remain, When children cannot find mates in reachable distances, when the network becomes too thin, the culture dissolves not with violence but with slow silence. The larger ecosystem, in a sense, was going through a related quiet crisis. Some of the great animals of the Ice Age would follow the Neanderthals into decline in the following thousands of years. The changes that stressed Neanderthal populations were pieces of a bigger transformation that would reshape the northern world by the time the last glacial phase ended. From this perspective, the Neanderthals were among the first to fall in a long series of related losses. That does not lessen their disappearance. If anything, it deepens it. They were not defeated in isolation. They were caught in an unraveling that took many other species with it, on a slower schedule. For us, looking back, the Neanderthal end is one of the most emotionally powerful moments in the human past, because of everything they were: strong, skilled, symbolic, caring, adaptive, and yet, in the last of their line, unable to keep enough of themselves alive to persist. What survives of them, outside our genes, are their sights, their bones, their tools, their occasional flashes of art or arrangement, their long, quiet record of endurance, and the story we now tell about them in halting attempts to see them as they really were. That story is still being written. And the more we learn, the more the older, easier versions have to be rewritten. Neanderthals were not a mistake on the way to us. They were another version of us. Their disappearance is not a footnote in the history of human progress. It is a chapter in the history of what humanity has cost, gained, and lost. The final chapter of this documentary will step back and try to answer the title's promise. We have seen how they lived. We have seen how they died. Now we have to answer, as clearly as evidence allows, the question the title asks. Who really were the strongest humans who ever lived, and why did they vanish? Chapter 10. The Answer. Written in bone and ash. We are ready to answer the title, not with a slogan, not with a simple sentence borrowed from a headline, but with the fullest response the evidence allows. Who were the strongest humans who ever lived? By the honest measure of physical anatomy, the Neanderthals belong at the very top of that list. Their bodies, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of life in cold and demanding environments, were compact, robust, and powerfully built. Their skeletons record habitual hard work and repeated physical stress. Their bones were often thicker than ours, their muscles clearly larger, their joints reinforced by years of use. A healthy adult Neanderthal male, in his prime, would have possessed a level of raw physical capability that most modern humans cannot easily imagine and cannot match without dedicated training. But the title does not stop at bodies. If strength includes the ability to endure through massive climate changes, to remain a coherent human population across an immense span of time, to shape stone with skill, to build fires in the deepest caves, to care for the injured, to teach the young, to bury the dead, and to leave DNA that still lives inside us thousands of centuries later, then their strength was even greater than muscle alone can measure. They were strong bodies within strong groups within strong traditions. Their strength was collective, not solo. It was cultural, not merely biological. It was quiet, not loud. And it lasted, in one form or another, for something like 300,000 years or more. Longer than most people can comfortably think about. By any responsible measurement, then, the Neanderthals earn the title. They were the strongest humans who ever lived, taken as a whole, when strength is understood to include both body and network, both individual force and collective endurance. Why did they vanish? Here, the answer must be more careful, because the evidence does not permit a single tidy cause. The old picture of Neanderthals being simply outcompeted or exterminated by smarter Homo sapiens has fallen apart under closer study. In its place, we now see something more complicated and more human. Their disappearance was the result of many overlapping pressures arriving at a time when their populations were already thin. Climate played a role. The late Pleistocene climate swung repeatedly. Familiar landscapes changed within decades. Prey routes shifted. Plant communities transformed. Neanderthals had adapted before, but never quite as quickly as this new pace demanded. Demography played a role. Late Neanderthal populations were small and scattered. Their genetic diversity was low. Their contact between groups was limited. Their capacity to absorb shocks was reduced by the very structure of their spread across the continent. Homo sapiens' arrival played a role, not as an army of conquerors, but as ecological competitors with slightly different tools, slightly different social webs, and a slightly different way of moving through the same landscapes. Where the two species overlapped, they sometimes fought, sometimes ignored each other, sometimes met, and sometimes had children together. But on average, over the long term, our species expanded while theirs contracted. Small factors piled up. Volcanic events, local disease outbreaks, bad seasons, injuries at critical moments in critical groups. Any one of these could be absorbed by a healthy population. All of them together, in a stressed population, could break it. The end came slowly, region by region, over thousands of years. There was no last battle. There was only the shrinking of the world, the thinning of the network, the increasing rarity of familiar faces at gatherings, and finally, in some corner of a southern refuge, a last Neanderthal who never knew he was the last, whose fire, when it went out, ended one of the deepest chapters of the human story. And yet, the ending is not total. They are inside us. Every person alive today whose recent ancestry lies outside sub-Saharan Africa carries a small but real percentage of Neanderthal DNA. Their genes participate in our immune systems, in our skin, in aspects of our metabolism, in the strange biology of our lives. They lost their world, but a slender genetic thread of them survived into ours. That fact reframes what extinction can mean. In their case, extinction was not total erasure. It was the loss of a distinct people, whose partial biological inheritance nonetheless travelled forward inside the human species that persisted. There is something important in acknowledging that. The disappearance of the Neanderthals is one of the great losses of prehistory. Their culture, their language, their songs and stories and rituals, all of that is gone. We cannot recover any of it. What we can recover, painstakingly, is a general picture of who they were and how they lived. That picture, corrected and refined over the past century of science, has grown steadily larger and more sympathetic. They were not simple brutes. They were not the failed cousins that older popular accounts described. They were people, in the fullest available meaning of that word. That reality changes how we should think about our own history. Homo sapiens is not the only success story of the human family, and other lineages did not fail simply because they were less than we are. Some of them, like the Neanderthals, lived skillfully and long. Their eventual disappearance says as much about the wider difficulties of their moment as it does about anything they lacked. And if we look honestly at their record, we find something humbling. They mastered a colder, harder world than most of us could survive, and they held it for a length of time our own species has not yet come close to matching. Their fate should also make us careful, not because we are on the edge of an ice age or a volcanic winter, but because the story of the Neanderthals reminds us that even a highly successful human population, well adapted to its world, can be undone by a combination of pressures. Small populations, reduced networks, environmental instability, competition from other groups. All of these can act on any people, in any time, given enough compounding force. Their story is a warning as much as it is a wonder, but most of all, their story is a mirror. When we look at their tools, their hearths, their eagle talons, their care for the wounded, their treatment of their dead, and their unexplained visits to deep caves, we see reflections of ourselves, different in the details, similar in the pattern. Their humanity is not our humanity, but it is close enough to be recognizable. Their strength was of a kind we can honor. Their end is of a kind we can mourn. Their survival, in the fragments of their DNA that endure in us, is of a kind we can carry forward with some kind of quiet responsibility. That is the answer, as honestly as we can give it. The strongest humans who ever lived were a compact, powerful, deeply cultural people who mastered one of the harshest environments in Earth's history for hundreds of thousands of years. They vanished not because of a single fatal weakness, but because a combination of climatic instability, small populations, ecological pressure, and contact with an expanding modern human species pushed them past the limits of what their communities could hold together. They left behind not only bones and stone, but also a piece of themselves inside our own genomes. They are gone, but not entirely. They live on in fragments, and in the story we now try to tell them. That story is not finished. New discoveries emerge every year. Genetic techniques refine our understanding. Archaeological revisitations of old sites, sometimes with new methods, bring old questions back to life. We may still be surprised. What we can say for now is that the picture painted by decades of careful work supports a Neanderthal history much richer and more complicated than the caricatures of the past. They deserved a more honest telling than they got for a long time. This documentary has tried to be part of a fairer telling, and when we conclude, we will not conclude with a simple summary. We will conclude with an image that belongs only to them, and only to this story, so that when the last words fall, what remains is not another set of definitions, but a memory of who they were, at their strongest and their most vulnerable, in the world they had. Conclusion. The last Neanderthal to walk the earth did not know she was the last. Perhaps she was an old woman in a southern cave, wrapped in worked hides, sitting by a small fire in the failing light of a winter afternoon. Perhaps she remembered her mother's voice, her sisters, her children, the people of her small band as they had been in her youth, when there had been more of them, when the fires along the coast had been more numerous, when the songs at the hearth had been sung by more voices. Perhaps she still expected, somewhere in the folds of hope that human beings carry, that another band would appear over the ridge someday. Perhaps she no longer expected anything at all. We cannot know. Her name, if she had one, is lost. Her language is lost. Her particular hearth, wherever it burned, is cold. But her body is not forgotten. Her people are not forgotten. And, in a way that quietly reshapes our sense of what extinction means, she is not entirely gone. A piece of her lineage, inherited over long chains of unions between Neanderthals and modern humans in the many thousands of years before her own time, still lives in the cells of billions of people today. She did not know that. She never could have known that. She only lived her life inside the boundaries of the world she had. That, in the end, is what all human lives are, whether they belong to us or to her. The story of the Neanderthals, told honestly, is not a story of failure. It is a story of a way of being human that endured through hundreds of thousands of years of hard weather and hard work, that mastered a continent, that made tools, kept fires, cared for its injured, remembered its dead, walked deep into caves for reasons that had nothing to do with hunger, and left in its wake a record we are still learning to read. It is also a story of an ending, arriving under pressures no single generation could see. It is a story of loss, and it is, quietly, a story about us. Because when we ask why the strongest humans who ever lived disappeared, we are not asking about strangers, we are asking about relatives. We are asking, in some sense, about ourselves. Their end contains hard lessons about the fragility of even the most successful lifeways. Their long survival contains hard lessons about the depth of what is possible for human communities when they are held together by shared knowledge, shared work, and shared care. We began this documentary with an injured man in a cave, alive years after wounds that should have killed him. We end it with an image on the other side of the same story, a late Neanderthal fire somewhere in a southern refuge, burning in the dark, tended by hands whose owners cannot know that they are among the last of their people. Around that fire, work goes on. Someone scrapes a hide. Someone speaks softly. A child sleeps. A memory is passed from one voice to the next. All of it is ordinary. All of it is entirely human. And then, eventually, the fire goes out. Not with a scream, not with a battle, not with a headline, just with the slow arrival of dawn, in a world that will soon forget these particular faces, but not the deep truth they carried. That truth is simple and hard. Strength alone is never enough. Endurance requires community. Community requires memory. Memory requires voices. And voices, once silenced, live only in what they left behind. The Neanderthals left much behind. Bones, tools, hearths, eagle talons, deep cave rings whose meaning we may never decode, careful placements of the dead, and, deep inside us, a small strand of their inheritance that still turns in every generation. That is why their story still matters, not as a curiosity, not as a footnote, but as one of the great chapters of what it has meant to be human. They were strong beyond most easy imagining. They were tender in ways that surprised the science that first tried to describe them. They were skilled. They were adaptive. They were, in the end, human, fully, without qualification. They were the strongest humans who ever lived. And they vanished not because of any single failure, but because the world tilted at a moment when they could not hold on, even after holding on for so long. They fell, as we all eventually fall, but in their case, an entire way of being human went with them. May we remember them not with pity, but with recognition, not with mourning alone, but with respect, not as failed shadows of ourselves, but as a family we did not get to keep, whose absence, once you feel it, cannot be undone. Somewhere, an old fire went out, long ago, but the stone still speaks, the bones still speak, the DNA still speaks. And so, in the telling of their story, do we.